Welcome to another episode of Rediscovering Conservatism, a webcast series that is jointly sponsored by New Direction and Fundación Civismo, where we seek to engage with some of the freshest thinking on the right across Europe and beyond. And today we are pleased to be joined by a close friend of conservatives in Europe and Euro realists. Yoram Hazony is a world-renowned Israeli author, philosopher, political theorist. Professor Hazony, you are currently the president of the Herzl Institute in Jerusalem, where you're based. You're also the chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation, which sponsored the second National Conservatism Conference back in February in Rome, just before COVID-19 made a mess of this year. But that was a very interesting event, and a lot of people who will be watching, tuning into this live stream will fondly remember the conversations and the encounters they were able to make in Rome slightly under a year ago. Currently, you're also the host of a very interesting talk show that you've called NatCon Talk. It's a similar series of web conversations similar to these, and we also encourage folks to check those out. But most importantly, and this is where I really would like to focus our conversation today, Professor, your 2018 book, The Virtue of Nationalism, was a worldwide success. It was widely read, widely reviewed across the world. The year after that, it was awarded the Conservative Book of the Year prize by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. And the reason I'm really happy to host you here is because this interview will be released shortly after your book is being published. A translated edition of your book is being published in French and German. We expect a lot of folks from those two countries to tune into this and hopefully to also read the version of the book in their respective languages. Now, I wanted to maybe take a step right back because your book does a really good job of explaining what nationalism is from a political theory standpoint, what it means as a political ideal, and how it should inform the way that independent nation states relate to one another on the world stage. But if we try to tailor our conversation here to the European context, Europeans have been the European discourse has just tarnished the idea of nationalism. There's just been so much stigma and so many misconceptions appended to it. And I wanted to begin maybe by asking you, why is it so important for Europeans to get reacquainted with what nationalism is as an ideal and how it applies to their politics?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the program. I appreciate it, and for all those kind words. And I'm happy to share with you, some of my thoughts on your questions. Look, nationalism is everybody living in a Western country knows nationalism was a very popular political theory in the 19th century. You can argue even much earlier in Britain and Holland and other places in Europe. And since the two world wars, the term nationalism has been kind of ruined. People are aware that Hitler called himself a nationalist. And in doing that, he succeeded in causing many people to think that to be a nationalist is to be a racialist, a biological imperialist, as the historian of nationalism Anthony Smith put it, and so it's become kind of a consummate evil. This doesn't change the fact that in many countries throughout the world, even to this day, the term nationalist still has its original meaning, which is a political theory that sees the world as governed best when many different nations are able to chart their own course according to their own political traditions and religious traditions. So nationalism in kind of its classical form is a view of the political order that says the best political order that we could hope for would be a world of many independent nations. And that was traditionally opposed to imperialism, which is also an ancient view that suggests that no, on the contrary, the world is governed best if, as much as possible, there's a single rule of law, a single way of doing things under which, as much as possible, all nations are going to be subsumed. And going all the way back to antiquity, the great empires of that we read about in the Bible were in general sent by their gods to go out and conquer the four corners of the earth in order to bring peace and prosperity. And this was the dream of Alexander. This was the dream of the Pax Romana. This was the dream of the Holy Roman Empire. And today, it's also the dream of the European Union and many others of a rules-based international order, or a liberal international order. The problem with this point of view is not that it's absolutely false and has nothing to recommend it. I think that definitely there are arguments to recommend imperialism rather than an order of independent nations. But the problem is that in the atmosphere after the two world wars, it's become very difficult to have a serious discussion on the subject, because there's kind of an overwhelming critique of the independent nation state, both from Marxists and from liberals. And a great many people, including even scholars, are no longer aware that of this extremely important history of political ideas which were anti-imperial and saw the independent nation as the key to a better world. I should jump to add quickly, as I write in my book, that I'm not a utopian, and I don't believe that there is a kind of an overall solution to the world's problems. I don't believe that a world of independent nations will solve all our problems, and I don't believe that an imperial order will solve all of our problems. But rather, it's important to be able to compare these political theories. My claim is that an order of independent nations is the better alternative, because it allows for greater freedom, competition among different kinds of systems. I think that empirically, most of the advances in government, in science, in the arts over the last few hundred years have taken place as a result of a competition among independent nations, and that the alternative, which is to create some kind of imperial or transnational body or set of bodies, is a road that will necessarily lead to oppression.
Sure, and this is, Professor, this is incredibly, this will be incredibly useful to our audience to just ground them in sort of the larger history and the larger theory of where nationalism comes from. And as we were discussing there just a second ago, it's a really hard conversation to have, especially in Europe, for the reasons you mentioned, for essentially the reason, as you described, that after World War II, there seemed to be an effort to confound what had been the calamities and the horrors of that specific moment in time in European history with nationalism, when in fact it was quite the opposite, as you describe in the book. Hitler was an imperialist. He had no respect for the sovereignty of nation states around him, and it seems to me, and this is where I want to begin my next question, it seems to me like on the pretense of shedding away that sort of that unsavory legacy, the European Union, or rather the current manifestation of European integration, has in fact returned to an imperialist format. And it is so important for our audience to hear the distinction you make here in terms of history, in terms of theory, between a world order of independent nation states and a world order where a single model attempts to rule over nations that remain distinct and historically different. So I want to use that for my next question, because at the conference that you held in Rome in February, many of the people that you gathered were united in a common dislike of the European Union and the current direction it has taken towards this sort of proto-federalist, hyper-liberal union. But they may not see eye to eye on how to counter it and what role to play within that structure. And you had different people from different persuasions, people from different parties attending your conference. So I wonder if you can maybe speak to how you see those differences playing out, what your message is to European conservatives who are now stuck against this project that is running out of kilter, that is essentially borrowing so much of that imperialism. What would you tell them, and how would you help them understand the challenge?
Well, let me just insert an advertisement. You can go to nationalconservatism.org, and you can actually watch the speeches from this and from the Rome conference and the London and Washington conferences that came before it. So I'll summarize my view, but all of the views of the other participants are there as well. I think it's undeniable that European nations have important common interests. Like the most obvious is the security interest, where the democratic nations of Europe do have to concern themselves about potential threat from the East, whether that's Russia or whether it's increasingly China. There are security issues from the Islamic world, which at the moment are being increasingly associated with Erdogan in Turkey, but there are all sorts of security issues to the south, and it would make no sense to say that every nation in Europe needs to be an island without any kind of alliance system to advance the common interests of Europeans. That would be absurd. And you can make you can ask similar questions about a common market. I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages to the common market, but for those of us who are generally in favor of freer economic movement, again, it would be foolish to say that the nations of Europe can't explore or shouldn't explore this kind of interest. But having said that, it's the next step that I find troubling, because having a common defense architecture, or having even a common trade zone, these things do not seem to require, for example, a common currency, which really does work systematically to dismantle the independent nations of Europe and to make them dependent on whoever's controlling the currency, which is, in general, it's going to be Germany as the strongest economy. I don't understand why there needs to be one system of law, one highest court that makes constitutional decisions. I don't understand why legislation should be, in general, as a general matter, should be supranational. Now, the consequences of these things, I think, are clear both to people in Britain who are trying to leave, and in people in other countries. Italians who have had the European Union meddle in determining who their finance minister is, which is just an extraordinary violation of the idea that the Italians are a self-governing people, or the constant efforts to try to discipline Hungary and Poland on issues like immigration, or what's called the rule of law. All of us, of course, favor the rule of law, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily favor the rule of EU law, which is what is being discussed. So if you go back to the fundamental argument that nations are different from one another, they have different experiences, historical experiences, they have different languages, different religions often, and different ways of thinking, different legal systems. The beauty of Europe's history is to a very large extent related to the fact that over many centuries, the nations of Europe, many of them developed as a kind of an independent self-awareness, which was anti-imperial. This includes the British and the Dutch and the French. It includes the Poles and the Hungarians, different peoples at different stages. And this diversity of traditions has meant that Europe is extraordinarily rich in different scientific traditions and different legal traditions. An example that I like to use, that I mention in the book, is that the difference between French rationalism and British empiricism is one of the most famous distinctions, rivalries, really, in the history of philosophy. And if you study Newton's science, you'll find that Isaac Newton was motivated to an extraordinary degree by his aversion to Descartes and Cartesian science. Right, he invented his method as an answer to the French method, and if it hadn't been for this diversity of intellectual cultures and this competition among nations, it's not clear that we ever would have had these astonishing scientific breakthroughs that were the result of the competition. So in general, again, I think that where it's necessary, as with defense and possibly economic cooperation, I would encourage a common policy in Europe. But what's happening now, the never-ending growth of federalism and the abuse of nations that simply want to do things their own way, is very difficult for me to understand.
Well, that's incredibly useful, and I really appreciate you giving us your 2 cents on a division that is going to stay with us within a front that we could term Euro-realism or conservative Euro-realism within us, and that's really going to be very useful. And that's a really interesting argument that I found in your book, is the idea that a world order of independent nation states allows for competition, whether that be in terms of legal systems or economic policy, and some of the stuff that you just described, the arts and science, are also major pieces of why we shouldn't strive to have this sort of uniform, homogeneous space where essentially these national distinctive traits and histories are not allowed to flourish. And I really appreciate you delving into it. And there's another reason that I think this is so important, is because, as you may be aware, whenever someone makes an argument against European federalism from a conservative perspective, generally the counter argument from the Euro federalists is that you're against this whole thing, and you want to reset this thing back to the aftermath of World War II, where there wasn't a common European project. And as you said, there's so many valid grounds for why we should want that level of cooperation on specific issues. You touched on security, obviously some level of economic harmonization, but it's very important for us to have a framework that allows us to make a case for what kind of integration we should want and which we shouldn't. I mean, as you said, we are now beginning to see that the EU is just not interested in voluntary cooperation between sovereign nation states. We have a supranational entity, sometimes that's the European Commission, sometimes it is the Parliament, but you essentially have institutions that are overweening and that want to impose themselves over the voluntary cooperation of nation states, as we've seen with the cases that you've mentioned, Hungary and Poland, etc. But I wanted to turn maybe to another aspect of your recent work that I think our European audience is also going to find so interesting. Is you obviously spent a lot of time in the United States. You've worked between Israel and America for many years. And American conservatives are themselves going through a lot of intellectual turmoil, right? Trying to figure out what the movement is going to look like in the years to come. And we've seen increasingly talk of, post-liberalism, or that's another big piece of your book, is a critique of sort of classical liberalism, Lockean liberalism. You argue that sort of went awry. And I wonder if you could explain what exactly is your critique of classical liberalism, and then maybe I'll ask you about how we can apply that to Europe as well.
Sure. I'm not a post-liberal, although people call me post-liberal. I don't mind it, but the truth is that I was never a liberal at any point, and so it's a little bit strange to be post. I mean, I grew up in a conservative family, and I was a conservative activist in college, and as far as I understand it, the conservative critique of liberalism hasn't really changed very much. So that critique is something I guess probably many of your listeners are familiar with it. In its most common form, liberalism is a political theory that describes the political order as using a very limited set of terms. The basic terms are individuals who are perfectly free and perfectly equal. That this is the way Locke describes it. There's a universal reason, which is the same for all human beings who, if they only choose to exercise it. And exercising universal reason, all individuals in all times and places are supposed to be able to conclude from the perfect freedom and perfect equality of human beings that no political obligation should ever be incurred except on the basis of consent. Okay, so those are kind of the axioms of the Enlightenment liberal system. There have been later liberal versions of liberalism that attempted to fix them up a bit. John Stuart Mill or Hayek have a more empirical liberalism, but overwhelmingly, when we talk about liberalism, we're talking about those axioms and that descend from Locke and Kant and Spinoza and Rousseau's on the social contract, and they continue to dominate intellectual life in Western countries to this day. Now, what's the problem with them? The problem with these axioms is that they are too simple, and they're not realistic in the sense that they leave out key parts of not just what it means to be human, but what it means to be politically human. The description of political life that comes from Enlightenment liberalism is missing crucial pieces that you need in order to have any intelligent conversation about political life. So if you ask, why is it that Marxism is so attractive despite the incredible destruction that it keeps wreaking on so many nations? The attraction of Marxism, when you're a student and you're studying Marxism, is that the instructors will say, look at how stupid liberalism is. They don't even recognize that human beings form cohesive groups, and that politics is always about cohesive groups, right? And in other words, a Marxist critique of liberalism says, look, everywhere you look, there's hierarchy. Everywhere. There's no society in the world. Even when you have a conference of libertarians who believe in principle that there should be no hierarchy, there's still hierarchy. There's always hierarchy. So this is an empirical fact that there are hierarchies, that these hierarchies compete with one another for power and prestige, that when they feel threatened, they can resort to violence, that politics is about, among other things, trying to find ways of avoiding that violence between competing hierarchies. These are fundamentals of political life. If you study anthropology or sociology, that's obvious. Everybody agrees. But when it comes to political theory, which is the most influential social science, the one, we learn in high school, how to think about the individual and the state. And then in college and then in graduate school, they just keep repeating it over and over again. And it just continues to be endless elaboration of individuals, free individuals, equal and consenting, and joining into consenting groups. Now, this empirical fact that liberalism has an insufficient theory, all right, that I'm not saying that equality isn't a value of importance, and I'm not saying that freedom isn't a value of importance. I'm saying that the liberal theory is so impoverished that it's simply false. And so what is needed, and what I try to do in my book, is to bring more empirically oriented political thinkers. There's a long tradition of them. I focus on the Anglo-American tradition, but there are other empirical thinkers across Europe as well. So I'm thinking of John Selden and the Common Lawyers. I'm thinking of Montesquieu, Edmund Burke, Blackstone, of course, the Scottish empiricists, Hume and Ferguson and Adam Smith, and an important one that people forget is Vattel. All of these are empiricist thinkers. They do not begin with these supposedly self-evident axioms of liberalism, and each of them helps to contribute to something which is, in fact, what you could call post-liberal. I mean, it's a critique and reaction against Enlightenment liberalism. And if you try to build a political theory out of the writings of those thinkers, and out of the historical experience of, let's say, the Westphalia treaties, which they're not themselves a work of political theory, but historically, the Westphalia treaties are the culmination of 150 years of attempts to determine in practice how you can have a diversity of political structures, a diversity of religions within Europe, and still be able to maintain the peace. That empirical experience informs empiricist political theory, almost all of which is post-liberal, as you call it. It's conservative. Because why is it conservative? Because it asks questions such as, what in reality is it that binds people into resilient families, tribes, and nations? It isn't consent. I mean, of course, some people choose to go and live in another nation and adopt it, but the actual real entity that is a family or a nation, right? Families can also adopt individuals from outside, just like nations can. But the fundamental entity that is a family or a tribe or a nation is held together by a deep mutual loyalty of the families and tribes within the nation. And the role of the political actor, the statesman, looking internally at the diversity of tribes and religions and streams within his nation or her nation, the role of the statesman is to take the existing balance, to identify those areas in which there has been too much injustice and it begins to threaten the system, and to make repairs in such a way that the overall structure can continue for another century, for a couple more centuries, and until the next crisis. So this conservative political theory, it's a reply to Marxism as well as liberalism, because it says the Marxists are correct that society does not consist of individual atoms. Society consists of groups, of loyalty groups, of religious and family and linguistic and other groups which are loyal to one another. And the conservative is looking to see how can we repair what we've inherited to prevent it from exploding into civil war and after Civil War invasion from all sides.
Yeah, this is really fascinating, Professor, and I'm so glad we were able to smoothly transition from our initial discussion of nationalism as an idea into liberalism, and where theoretically we can find flaws in it. I mean, you do a very good job yourself of blending those two in the book, and the reason I was also very interested in having your thoughts on this is obviously this is a pressing issue at the moment among American conservatives for reasons that have to do with their constitution that has clear roots in the sort of thinking you've described, John Locke's thinking, etc. And it's so important to kind of poke holes in this ideal vision of self-interested individuals coming together in a sort of a contractual manner, where the state is merely a way where each gets to kind of make hay out of the mutual agreement. And there's always a self-interested case. And in the book, in a big part of your book, you really take issue with this, and you explain that there's so much non-rational reasons for why we are bound in communities and families and tribes, and it's so important to go back to basics and explore those things. But if we can maybe now try to apply those things to Europe, I mean, as you've explained, maybe post-liberal is a label that doesn't fit to your own thinking, perhaps, but we've seen the label being thrown around in America a lot. And in some corners of Europe, what you've seen is, I wanted to get your thoughts on for instance, the expression of a liberal democracy, or this idea that the European Union, for instance, has sought to. There's for instance, a former Hungarian MEP, György Schöpflin, who speaks of liberalism having co-opted democracy in Europe, right? Of the EU being a liberal co-optation of democracy. And you have political movements, persuasions in Central Europe now, they're all about saying, listen, we are Democrats, but we're not liberal Democrats. And I wonder if, so first of all, do you see the same conflict between, with liberalism in Europe? We had a Prime Minister, Orban, a few years ago speak of illiberal democracy, and that was, the media made a whole deal about that. So do you see these same intellectual kind of arguments playing out in Europe, and how would you advise people to think about them?
Well, first of all, I would advise people to not focus too much on the word illiberal. I mean, you know, the word illiberal, unfortunately, has a couple of hundred years of meaning, at least in the English language. I don't know about other languages. And the word simply means miserly or stingy, because 200 years ago, the word, 250 years ago, the word liberal meant generous. So when you spoke of liberal government, when you read the British or the Americans writing about liberal government, they don't mean Lockean government. That's not what the word means. What they mean is a mild government, a government that is generous in how much freedom that it gives people. And the opposite of liberal in that sense is illiberal, which would mean stingy. So I advise people not to use that term. I've told my Hungarian friends that, but I don't think the word is what's important. I think what's important is to focus on the ideas, and the division, as I would describe it, is an argument between liberal democracy and conservative democracy. And people can find online, can find my essay on conservative democracy or my essay in American Affairs on what is conservatism. The central distinction between liberalism and conservatism in the English tradition, which is where it develops first, and then it spreads outward to many other countries, to the whole world, in fact. The central difference between liberalism and conservatism is that liberals understand the source of our freedoms to be in our capacity to reason and to construct from nothing, to make an agreement among people who've talked about it, and to construct from nothing a new government, which then will be, something close to the ideal government. Conservatives don't believe that any of that is possible. The conservative view is that if you take all of the liberties and that are most cherished by liberals, and you trace where they come from, and you'll find that where they come from is through the historical development over 400, 600, 800 years in Britain, as by trial and error, very conservative people attempt to gradually improve things on and also to restore earlier conditions when they feel that they've made a mistake. And almost all the rights that we know, certainly the whole idea of the separation of powers, the idea that property is the bulwark of freedom, of individual liberty, the rule of law in its actual meaning, all of these things are in the English tradition develop over many centuries. And by the way, they also developed in a completely integrated fashion with the reading of the Bible that is originally Catholic. Later it becomes Anglican, but at all points there is a dialogue between the English people's reading of the Bible and the way that they developed their traditional law, which is the fountainhead for all of these rights that liberals and conservatives believe in, but liberals simply want to do without English nationalism, the English drive for independence from Europe. They want to do without English Christianity and English Old Testament reading. They want to do without those things and say that everything that was derived through the hard work of all these centuries of tradition, actually it just sprang fully formed from the minds of some philosophers in the in the 1700s, and so that's all we need to do. A conservative democracy is different from a liberal democracy in that conservatives are aware of the fact that there can be no freedom and there can be no rights without a very, very powerful underlying tradition, religious tradition, nationalist tradition, which holds the country together and provides the space in which freedoms can develop. It's the space in which democracy can develop, because it's based on a nation that has a strong degree of internal loyalty and that makes changes in its traditions when there's a feeling that that loyalty is breaking down and it needs to be repaired in some way. This means that naturally conservatives will be suspicious of liberal plans to remove religion from the public sphere. They'll be suspicious of liberal plans to remove the borders that allow nations to be free and to conduct their historical experiments. And more generally, the conservatives are simply more empiricist than the liberals are, meaning in a conservative democracy, you are likely to find a prime minister who's elected who says, well, you know, in our country, we do it this way, but in other countries, they do it other ways. And it's not our place to dictate to the world how to do things, even though we think we do it best, because we might be wrong. And we know that in history, many times nations are wrong. So we're going to do our experiments and you do your experiments, and we grant legitimacy to your experiments. And, you know, as long as they're not, you know, insane, as long as you're not building a world empire to, you know, to destroy everyone who's biologically different from you. But, you know, within some kind of common sense, we recognize that other nations do things differently. And if you succeed with your experiment, then we will praise you for it. Then we might even imitate you. That kind of empiricism, even skepticism, is crucial in maintaining decent relations among nations. Because when you have a liberal democracy instead of a conservative democracy, and the country is headed by people who believe that their brain has captured the universal truth that's true for all nations, then they start doing all sorts of crazy things. They invade Iraq and Afghanistan and start dictating to the Afghanis what kind of government that they should have and what kind of schools they should have for their children. I mean, it's really crazy. We're talking about people who know nothing about Afghanistan, yet they're certain that they know how to rule Afghanistan. And this is, it's a disaster waiting to happen in one country after another. You mentioned what's taking place in America right now. In America right now, what's happening is that there's as in many places in Europe, America has a profound conflict between liberal internationalists on the one hand and conservative nationalists on the other. And the conservative nationalists want America to take care of its own problems. Doesn't mean that it will ignore the world, but it will stop believing, according to the nationalists, that it knows what's best for every country on earth. And so, you know, if they're doing the wrong thing, then we should just go out and conquer them. Whereas liberal internationalists say, no, how evil of you. The best hope for the world is that we Americans, who are so smart and know how to run our country so very well, should spread that to the rest of the world and make sure that everyone has the same rules. And the same attitude you see in Brussels, and you see it in all sorts of important leaders in Europe, such as the Chancellor Merkel, up until recently, the French president, although he seems to be, I don't know, he's young, maybe he's learning as he gathers experience. But until recently, Macron and Merkel were as crazy as these Americans in saying, we have the liberal truth and it should rule everything.
And I'm so glad you've helped us, Professor, unpack the political theory behind these important notions of liberalism, nationalism, all the way down to the concepts that you've just described in terms of empiricism, rationalism, etc. And I'm really glad towards the concluding remarks you made there that you seem to have come back full circle towards the discussion of what nationalism really entails, which in Europe is too often taken to mean as sort of a chauvinistic celebration of national cohesion, which we embrace as well as the basis of our political experiment. But it also means, and this your book makes very clear, that it also means a respect for other people's sovereignty and the idea that we are a world order made up of independent nation states. And I feel like that piece that you've just walked us through there just a minute ago is so important for Europeans to understand, is that as you call it, I believe that the expression in your book is the desire to rule ourselves, or the collective right of a free people to rule themselves, is only one side of the coin. The other side of the coin being respecting other nations' right to the same, right? And I'm so glad we were able to pack all of that into one conversation. You've been very gracious with your time. There's perhaps only one very brief exit question, Professor, that I'd like to ask you, and we'll let you go after this. This is very brief, and it can just be a couple of brief thoughts, as we've agreed to let the gridlock and mess of Israeli politics on the margins for this conversation. But there's so much talk recently of the breakthrough in Arab-Israeli relations. We've recently seen Prime Minister Netanyahu sign agreements with a range of Arab nations. The latest reporting is that Saudi Prince MBS is now on track to join those other Arab nations in brokering an agreement. So the important thing, I think, is that just like the liberal internationalists in America never believed that this could ever happen, particularly not under a Trump presidency, the European Union was also never too gung-ho about Middle East peace. They never believed it could happen, that you could see these Arab states coming to the table and recognizing Israel. Why is it so important what we're seeing? And is there anything you could, why does it prove liberal internationalists wrong on that respect? Now that they're essentially back in office with President like Joe Biden.
Well, look, I don't actually know what the Biden administration is going to do, so I don't want to begin by saying that that they're going to screw everything up. Let's give them time and see. Maybe they will have learned some things from the last few years. As you suggest, the important thing when we look at what's happening in the Middle East is to, first of all, to recognize that for 50 or 60 years, all of the smartest diplomats in the West were wrong about what would bring peace to the Middle East. In the last few weeks, for those of you who don't know, the last few weeks, the State of Israel has signed peace agreements with 3 Arab nations, and it appears that there are several more that are being negotiated behind the scenes. And this is, from the perspective of an Israeli, you can't imagine the rejoicing and the enthusiasm here in Israel. Now, of course, we have to give it time. It just happened. We have to give it time and see whether whether it really is what it looks like. So any comments right now are going to be preliminary. But what it looks like at the moment is the following: Arab countries. There are Arab countries in the Middle East, maybe most of them, that are willing to give up on the dream of a Muslim crusade or an Arab crusade that would bring about the domination of the Arab nation, or in other versions of Islam, and to adopt something that looks much more like the Westphalian peace in Europe, where we don't try to get everyone to agree about everything, because that's not possible. You can't get Jews and Christians and Muslims and Shiites and Sunnis. You can't get them to agree about everything, but you can apparently get them to agree where there are mutual interests among the different countries. And there have been mutual interests for a very long time that should have brought Israel together with certainly the Gulf states. I mean, it's now been 40 years since the Iranian Revolution began to threaten the stability of the Sunni kingdoms in the Persian Gulf. 40 years they've had to think about this. They understand that Shia imperialism is a threat to them, and they also understand that it's a much that threat is far more important to them and their peoples and their way of life and whatever they hold dear than Israel. Israel doesn't have imperial aspirations. It's not interested in conquering the Persian Gulf, and so, but it is interested in avoiding the Iranization of the entire region. And that means that there are extremely profound security interests that Israel has in common with Arab countries. And as soon as you start thinking about it, you can also see that closely related are extremely profound economic mutual interests. Israel is a country with limited natural resources, but a great deal of know-how in science and technology, and a huge incentive to improve its standing in the region. And many of these countries have vast wealth and vast natural resources, and can use a collaboration with Israel in terms of science and technology, and in the economic sphere as well as in the military sphere. So the real question is, why did this not happen before? And the answer, you hinted to it, is because of a completely false conception among liberal internationalists. And here I'm including both Republicans and Democrats, right? Both the European social liberals and the European Christian liberals. All of these major political parties, they shared a conception of the Middle East, which said that the Jews and their state are the problem. And I'm talking about people who care for Jews, people who love the state of Israel, feel that they want to help the state of Israel. Many of those were the most guilty in saying the problem is that the Jews are an alien implantation. The Arab world cannot accept them. They are endlessly mortified by their belief that Arab lands were stolen by Israel and by the Zionists, and there is no way to get past that on the basis of mutual interests. We simply have to talk and talk and talk and talk until we agree. And it turns out that was nonsensical. It never worked, and it was never going to work, because you can't agree. In fact, the opposite. When you share interests, powerful interests with someone, and you work together, then you're able to come to agreement on an empirical basis, because you work together and you see that you can trust one another, then you can come to agreement. But all of that talking, that sitting and talking, decade after decade after decade of negotiating, it's just a fantasy. I want this, I want that. No, but you can't have that because I want this. Got us nothing and nowhere. And I would suggest that, if it turns out that this almost miraculous new peace that's between the Arabs and the Jews in the Middle East, if it turns out that it is as good as what it looks like at the moment, then we should start thinking about how many other attempts in the world Americans and Europeans are making to try to create peace by talking instead of by working together on the basis of actual common interests.
Well, that's an incredibly hopeful note to end on, Professor, and I'm really glad you placed European diplomats as well in the sort of the usual suspects, and they've also had a share of guilt in the sort of the liberal internationalist delusion that didn't see this coming and that still doesn't believe it. And we're so happy with what's been happening with these peace agreements. And most of all, thank you so much, Professor, for your time. We'll just remind folks that The Virtue of Nationalism was initially published in 2018, but it just came out in French and German, so that folks can head over to their local bookstores or online and get a copy. And thank you so much, Professor, for being with us today.
Thank you very much. God bless you.
God bless you. Take care.